Free Palestine!
Hi friends, welcome to Planet Decolonized. My name is Dr. Norita Roy Chaudhary. I have a PhD in Law and Development. And so for those who are watching me for the first time, Planet Decolonized is nothing but a creative and an experimental and a critical space to explore questions of socio-ecological crises affecting people and communities across the globe because of capitalism, colonialism, climate crisis, and biodiversity crisis, and other forms of crisis that is affecting our support systems to live well on this planet. So in today's episode, basically, I will be talking about why India and the Global South, more generally, must stand in solidarity with Palestine for climate justice and planetary justice as well. So this video, I'm not really going to talk about the legal aspect, rather I'm going to talk about the political economy of Palestine and what in that political economy understanding actually makes the Palestine issue a global issue as well, for that is affecting all of us, irrespective of which geographical region we live in. So political economy today is about understanding the capitalism-driven relationship between economic and power relations at the global, state and local societal levels, showing how human sufferings elsewhere are connected to our collective struggles at home. In this lecture, I will explain how the political economy of Palestine is embedded in the global structure of fossil capitalism, Zionist ideology, the European nation-state concept, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism that make ongoing genocide against Palestinian people and dispossession, and how our own subjugation by Western imperialism is structurally linked to these systems. In part 1, I will explain how from the Nakba to the Naksa, Israel's settler colonial state has historically and violently expelled, killed and dispossessed Palestinians while seizing their land and labor. In part 2, then, I will discuss Palestine's political economy of settler colonialism, Zionism, and simultaneous rise of fossil capitalism. In part 3, I will situate the Israeli-led settler colonization of Palestine within the global structure of racial capitalism and its direct connection to Western domination over the global South and the climate and ecological crisis more generally. I will show how what is happening in Palestine is a global genocide, an attack on the support systems that enable people to live on this planet. I will end with the need for India and the Global South countries to come together in solidarity with Palestine to prevent a planetary scale climate breakdown. So coming to part 1. The territory historically known as Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire from 1516 to 1917. In 1917, the British government published the Balfour Declaration, giving its support for the establishment of a Jewish national home in what was to become the Mandate Palestine. So Mandate Palestine was a geographical territory under British imperial control, carved out of defeating Ottoman southern Syria after the First World War. This aligned with the British imperial strategy of controlling the Suez Canal to secure regional dominance as oil became central to maintaining British domination. In 1922, the League of Nations formalized the mandatory Palestine under British imperialism. The mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration. Jewish immigration from Europe increased significantly in 1920s and 1930s, facilitated by British imperialist policy. Rising European anti-Semitism and nationalist movements in the late 19th century had already shaped Zionist ideology, which sought Jewish statehood in Palestine. Zionist institutions, political, economic, and military, developed in parallel to Palestinian society. Then in November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a partition resolution proposing to divide Palestine into an Arab and a Jewish state. The Jewish Agency accepted the plan, while the Arab leaders rejected it and opposed any territorial division, arguing that it violated the principle of national self-determination written in the UN Charter, which grants people the right to decide their own destiny. The proposed plan allocated 55% of the land to the Jewish state, even though Jews constituted roughly one-third of the population and owned about 7% of the land. Palestinians and the surrounding Arab states rejected this plan, viewing it as unjust. However, it provided international legitimacy for the establishment of Jewish statehood. On May 14, 1948, Israel declared itself an independent and sovereign state. However, its statehood occurred through the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, known as the Nakba or catastrophe. The Nakba refers to the mass murders and expulsions of Palestinians in 1948, when over several months, Jewish militia groups carried out raids, massacres, and depopulation campaigns across the country under Zionist leadership, dispossessing approximately three-quarters of the Palestinian population en masse, including over 700,000 people. Through the Nakba, Israel established itself as a sovereign state on Palestinian land, creating what became the largest body of permanent refugees at that time. It is for this reason that Israel is described as having been founded as a settler colonial state on occupied Palestinian land. The Nakba was not a war, but a Western-supported apartheid state formation. In June 1967, known as the Naksa, meaning setback or defeat, during the Six-Day War between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, Israel occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, occupying whatever homelands remaining with the Palestinians after the Nakba. These territories have since been recognized internationally as occupied. Settlement expansion, annexation of East Jerusalem, and the separation barrier was widely regarded as violations of international law. The occupation is unlawful in both duration and practice. Palestinian scholar Rabia Iqbaria, in his recent paper, argues that the Nakba transformed from mass expulsion into an ongoing regime of domination and genocidal violence, structured to deny Palestinian self-determination. Palestinian labor has functioned as a reserve labor force within the Israeli army, embedding dispossession in capital accumulation. So the Naksa basically means defeat. Further Palestinian lands were confiscated and more number of Palestinians were expelled despite the even after the Nakba in 1948. So Naksa happened after the Nakba, and the Palestinian scholar Rabia Iqbaria basically argues that Nakba is not an event that happened in 1948. It is a structure because it keeps repeating itself because of the settler colonial structure, and that repetition happens through ongoing forms of genocide or killing of a particular group belonging to certain racialized communities, which is the Palestinians in this case. Now coming to part 2. Settler colonial scholars Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang define settler colonialism as a structure in which settlers come to stay, seeking sovereignty over land, by eliminating indigenous people and previous inhabitants. Erasure through law and policy turns land, its water, air, and underground soil or the subterranean soil into exploitable property for settler capitalism to flourish. Climate and environmental justice scholar Kyle White further argues that settler colonialism violently disrupts indigenous relationships with the environment and nature more broadly. It is ecological violence because killing the conditions of people's collective dependence on land and nature is central to settler colonial domination. This racist structure laid the perfect ground for the fossil fuel capitalist structure to sustain itself, another violent form of extractivism that caused the climate and ecological crises elsewhere. Now, what is fossil capitalism? So, climate scholar Andreas Malm argues in his book, Fossil Capital: The Rise of Steam Power and the Roots of Global Warming, Britain's 1840 deployment of coal-powered steamboats marked a turning point, enabling controlled military force and transforming fossil capital into a militarized fossil empire. By globalizing fossil fuel energy through naval warfare, Britain established a world economy organized around extractivism. Then, after 1917, British control of Palestine helped integrate the region into this fossil fuel based imperial order centered on coal, oil, and other fossil fuels. The authors of the book, Resisting Erasure: Capital, Imperialism, and Race in Palestine, further identify two post-World War II shifts that shaped fossil capitalism. The first is the transition from coal to oil. The second is the consolidation of US imperialism or US domination, more generally over the global south. Fossil capitalism requires vast energy resources to sustain endless consumption in the global north and economic growth. The Middle East's strategic importance lies in its oil reserves and major trade routes, including sea and land. By the 1950s, the Middle East contributed to roughly 40% of known oil reserves. Between 1947 and 1960, its oil fueled Europe's reconstruction and militarization, while Western corporations controlled extraction and pricing. At the same time, the United States consolidated global power in 1944 through the Bretton Woods Agreement, which anchored the dollar at the center of the global financial system. Oil was traded in dollars, binding global energy markets to American currency dominance. Securing Middle Eastern oil therefore became central to US domination and military power. So basically, securing economic power is helpful for securing political power at the global scale, and US was able to achieve this through manipulating the currency system by making dollar the hegemonic one or the more dominant one. Local settler colonial rule is reinforced through these oil-based global alliances, which also include the Gulf states. Palestinian liberation is therefore inseparable from the Middle East's role in the global energy order. Western political and military backing of Israel consolidates this order through corporate and military networks that circulate cheap labor, resources, and weapons. After 1967, US support for Israel intensified, consolidating it as a strategic ally in a vital oil region aligned with US's fossil capitalist priorities. Recent normalization initiatives with Israel, from the Abraham Accords with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, to ongoing negotiations with Saudi Arabia in 2025, have further integrated Israel into oil-rich Arab states, strengthening America's economic position while diluting the issue of Israel's violent settler colonial rule over Palestine. So, a lot of Palestinians are opposing this normalization through diplomatic and economic ties, global economic ties, because what happens is, like, through these global trade agreements, uh, subtly there is a recognition and a normalization of the Israeli colonial state and its violent and the subtle acceptance of its occupation and rule over the Palestinians. Settler colonialism in relation to Palestine is framed as a core aspect of a Western imperialist backed Zionist ideology. Zionism, like I already mentioned, emerged in the late 19th century in the context of rising European anti Semitism or prejudice against Jewish people and developed alongside Western imperial ambitions. The Zionist ideology was central in justifying the creation of a separate Israeli nation state for the minority Jewish population as a project that required the permanent erasure of Palestinian identity and the killing of Palestinian people. Zionism was also intertwined with the European nation state concept to solidify a singular Jewish identity. As discussed in my video on carceral state, check that out. The European nation state model sustains itself through a singular dominant identity, positioning racialized and minority populations as second class citizens and resources available for cheap labor exploitation. For example, the superiority of the Jewish population is embedded in the Israeli constitution itself through the enactment of the 2018 Basic Law, Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, in which the realization of the right to exercise national self-determination is granted only to the Jewish people, making the exclusion of Palestinians not a byproduct but foundational to Israeli citizenship. In this way, Palestinians face structural racism. It is structured through constitutional legal frameworks that exclude Palestinian identity as subordinate to the Jewish identity. Rather than simply a Jewish aspiration for statehood, structural racism against the Palestinians situates the Zionist project within a broader history of Western capital seeking strategic footholds in economically vital regions, using pre-existing racial hierarchies to justify dispossession and control. The racist structure cannot be separated from the rise of fossil capitalism, the system in which capitalist expansion became dependent on indiscriminate extraction of fossil fuels and of cheap and racialized labor. Now coming to part 3. Fossil fuels kill indiscriminately, disproportionately harming poor communities, especially in the global south, because rising CO2 levels intensify climate impacts like heat waves, extreme temperatures, wildfires, cyclones, and unseasonal rainfall. Under fossil capitalism, mass deaths that are otherwise avoidable become an accepted byproduct of capitalism's killing machine. After 1917, British control of Palestine helped integrate the Middle East into a fossil fuel-based imperial order centered on oil, and after 1947 and 1967, Western backing of the Israeli Zionist state aligned with consolidating and defending this killing machine, which is capitalism. In this view, the destruction of Palestine and the expansion of fossil capital is what climate scholar Andreas Malm calls the destruction of the earth in his book titled The Destruction of Palestine is the Destruction of the Earth. The framework of racial capitalism is important because it situates Palestinian anti-colonial struggles for land and the right to return to occupied homelands amid the ongoing Nakba and genocide within an unequal global class structure built on racialization of the global south as subordinate to the global north. So racial capitalism is important because it situates the local settler colonial structure within the global structure where which is a global structure of capitalism, which creates an unequal and racialized class between the white people and the non-white people across the global, within the global north, and also across the global north and the global south. So racial capitalism basically draws attention to the global racialized class structure. Now, historian Robin Kelly interprets Cedric Robinson's theory of racial capitalism to interpret Historian Robin Kelly interprets Cedric Robinson's theory of racial capitalism to explain that capitalism emerged from as well as perpetuates racial hierarchies inherited from European feudalism, making racialization, slavery, violence, imperialism, and genocide foundational to its global expansion. Basically, racial hierarchies already existed within Europe that enabled its feudal structure to expand elsewhere through the racialization and colonization of indigenous, black, and non-white people. So the racial capitalism theory was propounded by Cedric Robinson, and now I took that Robinson's interpretation by Kelly. The theory basically argues that capitalism relies on already existing racial hierarchies. Capitalism did not invent racial hierarchies, even though even though capitalism keeps recreating further racial hierarchies, but for the system to function, it already depended on certain racialization processes and racialized structure that pre-existed. And this happened within European feudal structure itself, and this structure, the European feudal structure, was transported and transplanted globally through colonization. So, racial capitalism shows how the dispossession of Palestinian land and labor is not an isolated outcome of a so-called religious conflict between Muslim and Jewish groups, but rather a mechanism through which global South and indigenous populations and territories are subordinated, militarized, and exterminated to secure cheap land, energy, and labor for the benefit of power-hungry states and multinational corporations. Palestinian resistance challenges not only Israeli occupation, but Western imperialism and the fossil capitalist energy order that is causing the global climate breakdown. It is neither a religious conflict between Judaism and Islam, nor a distant issue irrelevant to India and the global South more broadly. Climate justice is inseparable from ending occupation, apartheid, settler colonialism, and genocide. Islamophobia is deliberately being used by India and Western governments as a political tool to divert global attention away from Palestine's anti-colonial struggles for land and climate justice against fossil capitalism. Companies are investing more in oil and gas production now than ever since Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius commitment to limit greenhouse gas emissions, and yet the structures of racial and fossil capitalism continue to expand even as we have crossed 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries for living safely on Earth. In 2023, the world already reached the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit according to the International Paris Agreement law, exposing how deeply interlinked extractive capital accumulation and climate breakdown have become. Dismantling the fossil capital structure is central to climate change mitigation and requires breaking the alliances between the United States, Israel, the Gulf monarchies, and the authoritarian governments that sustain US imperialism, fossil fuel extractivism, and importantly, our extractive relationship with land and nature. A free Palestine is actually seen as a threat precisely because it could galvanize wider regional struggles in the Middle East against Western oil capital and authoritarian regimes built on extractive capital accumulation. So basically, a free Palestine is nothing but a free Middle East, and a free Middle East is the end of end of capitalism that runs on fossil fuels. And this is exactly what degrowth scholar Jason Hickel's video went viral for, because he explained it in with utmost brevity, that a free Palestine is a free Middle East, and a free Middle East is the end of capitalism. And that's the point why the Global South should come in solidarity with Palestine. The case of Palestine shows how corporations and Western governments supply lethal and internationally prohibited weapons to militarize land and kill the people least responsible for the climate crisis, all to extract fossil fuels that power global capitalist lifestyles. For example, a recent Al Jazeera investigation published on the 10th of February 2026 revealed that US supplied thermal and thermobaric bombs capable of exceeding 3,500 degrees Celsius have vaporized thousands of Palestinians. And how? These munitions disperse a fuel cloud that ignites into a massive fireball, generating extreme heat and pressure that can turn human bodies into ashes in a matter of few seconds. The combination of intense oxidation, heat, and shockwave energy causes body fluids to boil instantly and tissues to combust, leaving almost no trace. Imagine the extent to which capital is being protected. The capitalists are protecting capital through militarization, and at the cost of like killing anybody who comes in the way of energy. It is for this reason that Global South solidarity with Palestinian liberation, including India's, becomes politically decisive in challenging the violent settler-colonial alliance and global fossil capital driving the mounting greenhouse gas emissions and climate breakdown. India and other nations of the Global South share histories of colonial dispossession, ongoing Western imperialism, extraction, and climate vulnerability. Supporting Palestine is therefore not separate from advocating for social and environmental justice and resistance to a fossil capitalist order that disproportionately harms those least responsible for causing the rise in greenhouse gas emissions or the climate crisis. So friends, in this video, basically it was important I think it was important for me to explain that the political economy of Palestine can be explained through structures of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and fossil fuel based economy that combines with the Zionist ideology in order to consolidate the capitalists' hold over the Middle East. It's important for us to break this alliance, for civil society organizations, to break this alliance between the US, the Middle East, then Israel, and all the global corporations and their capture over energy, because energy is being, like, one could argue that we need energy for our lifestyle, yes, but we can think of other ways of pumping our lifestyle. And first of all, there has to be a global downscaling of our lifestyle in order to reduce our consumption and the throughput pressure that creates massive impact on the environment. And so it's already, we have crossed 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries, and there's hardly any time remaining, and it's for this reason, like, a free Palestine is important for all the communities elsewhere to tackle the climate problem as such. And scholars of climate justice cannot ignore the Palestinian liberation issue, because it's totally centrally linked to this problem of to the solution of climate mitigation, actually. Anyway, so this is what the video is about, and if you have interesting comments, constructive comments, please do share them. and I'm always interested in expanding my own understanding of the political economy of the Middle East. So yeah, let's remain critical and keep engaging in critical scholarship. Until then, please remember that issue with Palestine has nothing to do with Muslims versus Jews. It's to do with the Palestinian anti-colonial struggle for land. That is very key, and this struggle is also connected to climate mitigation. Yeah, like I already said. Thank you. Peace.